There are so many types of brushes to choose from when it comes to acrylic painting. So what I want to do is give you basic information on how to choose a paintbrush for a specific job so that you could choose the right paintbrushes for you. First of all, there are super cheap paint brushes out there, like at the dollar store or whatever. My opinion on this is that I can make the most of pretty much any tool. It might not be the ideal situation, but I know that I could get something decent, or I could still learn to paint even with the most basic cheap tools. The only thing to keep in mind with cheap brushes is that they tend to lose their bristles. So you could work really hard at a painting and have some bristles fall on your paint and not realize it, and then it dries and it bakes in and you can't really take them off. That's frustrating. It's happened to me before. Another thing that can happen also is that the glue might not be super quality here in the ferrule, and then this might happen. Even though it's not ideal, if that's all you have, you can absolutely make it work and still learn a bunch of techniques with super cheap brushes. One type of brush, though, that is super cool to get at the dollar store is those big Bob Ross types of brushes, or the brushes that you use to paint your walls. There's different types and sizes. I would get a couple of those, like a thinner one and a thicker one. Depending on the type of work you might do, it might not be useful, but for more expressive type of paintings, larger canvases, abstract work, those are really handy and interesting to use. Personally, I would recommend going to the art supply store to get brushes. Even as a beginner, there's always good deals that you could find, and you don't have to buy 30 brushes. You can buy a few and it'll serve you well. Because of the way things are set up in the art supply store, I used to think that there were hard rules when it came to these are oil paint brushes, these are watercolor brushes, these are acrylic paint brushes, and that's not necessarily true. Some brushes will work better with acrylic paint, and some other types of brushes will work better with watercolor. But for me, the best way to think of it is more to understand what works well with acrylic and what types of brushes you're looking for. This way you can just pick any brush you want, no matter in what section you can find it. Let's start with long handles versus short handle brushes. Basically, it's just a question of whether you want to work on an easel and be further away from your canvas, or work on a tabletop and kind of be pretty close. And that's why typically acrylic paint brushes and oil paint brushes are longer, like with a longer handle, because often we use an easel, but not always. And watercolor brushes are usually small because you work on paper and on a tabletop. A longer handle also allows you to use the brush kind of like this to have more spontaneous and more expressive brush strokes, as opposed to use it more like a pencil and be super close like this. So for more abstract, expressive, impressionistic styles, a longer handle is typically supposed to help you get that kind of feel on your canvas. You can still kind of do it with a shorter handle. It might not be as dramatic, but it's typically used for more precise work. I say typically because I personally prefer shorter handles, just because I have the option to do whatever I want. I could use a shorter handle and still work on canvas and still kind of like have those expressive strokes if I want to. But when I do want to work closer to my work on a tabletop, I don't have a long handle poking me in the face. The length of the brush is pretty much a question of personal taste. When it comes to bristles, there are natural bristles that come from animals, and there are synthetic bristles. I prefer synthetic bristles for obvious reasons, but also nowadays they're really, really well made. They hold the paint really well, they hold water really well, and they're more durable. And synthetic brushes are cheaper, so to me, they're the best choice. Another thing to look for when it comes to bristles is how firm and how soft they are. For example, in watercolors, you'd be looking for a bristle that would hold water so that you don't have to dip back again and again, so that you could do nice gradients and so that your brush strokes would go farther without you having to dip back. So holding a lot of water. If the bristle is too kind of like plasticky and thicker and too coarse, it might not hold as much water and you might have to keep dipping back. And obviously a very soft bristle versus a very firm bristle in acrylic paint will give you a different type of stroke. It's good to have both types. Too soft of a bristle, like something very flimsy that bends super easily, might not hold the paint when it comes to acrylic paint, because if you take a big glob of paint, the bristle might not be able to kind of hold it. That type of bristle would be better suited for watercolor, which is very thin. Like too soft of a bristle might be kind of like a makeup brush that you would use for blending your eyeshadow, or like a very gentle blush brush that might be too soft. It'd be good to put a bunch of water on your canvas to create like thin washes, but other than that, it would be more suited for watercolors. So anything that is kind of like medium soft to firmer would be ideal for acrylic painting. And as a beginner, for most of my paint brushes, I would stick to the medium type of firmness for bristles, and I would probably experiment with one super soft and one super firm and see how it works within my painting style. When it comes to paint sizes and styles, there are so many different types, and I'm not gonna bore you with names and technicality. Basically, as a beginner, I would think of it as flat brushes, like this. Sometimes they're more rounded, but they're still flat, and rounded and pointy brushes in all different sizes. Typically, flat brushes are meant to block colors within your painting. Very often it's the first layer, and as you put in more details in the painting, you have smaller and smaller brushes. Flat brushes also make it easier to create like a very sharp line, so sharp straight edges, mountains and rocks and buildings to create the basic shapes. And pointy brushes, as you might have guessed, are more for fluid lines, for details, tree branches, features in portraits. And obviously, the smaller the bristles, the more detailed you can get. Also, one cool tip that I have would be to have odd brushes in your collection. It could be a toothbrush to create like spatters and like flick paint on the canvas to have that type of texture. Also, really old dried up brushes. Do I have one here? Yeah, with like messed up bristles. They're very interesting to kind of like stipple some texture on the canvas for maybe foliage, or create unique types of lines, or maybe help you when detailing grass. You can also cut up different shapes within your brush to give you unique lines and different textures. So old worn out brushes are really a keeper, and they're very interesting to use in many different situations. So I would keep them in my collection for sure. When it comes to types of brushes and brush stroke techniques, what brush does what, there's a bunch of videos on it, but one thing that is very neglected that we don't really think about is to kind of doodle with paintbrushes. Sounds weird, but it's very interesting. It's fun to do because you kind of just don't think about what you're doing. You're just putting paint on the canvas in different types of ways. And that's how some people discovered that with one specific type of brush, they could, in basically 1 or 2 strokes, paint a flower. And as a beginner, I remember not being sure what to paint, or sometimes specific paintings that I had in mind seemed kind of too hard for my skill level, but I still wanted to paint or learn or get better at it, and that's a good way to do it. It seems like it wouldn't do anything to just doodle with paintbrushes on a piece of paper, but it really does. Ideas will pop in your head when you see a specific texture, thinking, oh my god, this would be perfect for this type of flower, or for grass, or for whatever, and you'll remember to use it in your painting. I'm sure you've seen Bob Ross tutorials. You know how he uses a palette knife with a little bit of white and blue or gray, and then he drags it across the canvas and a mountain appears. It looks super easy, and it kind of is in a way. You need to fiddle with it a little bit the first few times you do it, but then you see that the palette knife and the paint does the job for you, literally. You just know what tools to use, and it's not you that's controlling it in a super professional way. The tool does the job for you. Learning the traditional way to use different paint brushes to do different things, like create tree foliage or create clouds or whatever, will save you tons of time for sure, but experimenting for yourself will give you your own personal style. If I had to put together my ideal beginner paintbrush collection, I'd probably use one Bob Ross type of paintbrush that you can find at the dollar store. Then I would pick a few flat brushes of different sizes. So like either a big, medium, and a small, or maybe just a medium one and a smaller one. The flat brush could be sharp or it could be rounded. Then I would get a few pointy brushes, maybe a bigger one just to experiment with, but mostly I would get smaller detailed brush because I feel like you would get more use out of them, they're more useful. And if the budget allows, I would take a funky kind of brush to just experiment with, or a brush that I'm kind of attracted to, and then I would try to figure out ways to include it in my art practice, or different ways to use it that's kind of unique and interesting. And if you want your paintbrushes to last super long, watch this video. I show you how I clean and take care of my brushes. There are good tips in there. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post videos every week. I'll see you again very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.